I'm going to do a quick review of Chapter 16. It's a short chapter, but a very important one because it relates to sales, which is the biggest area of contract. Sales relates to those transfer of title of goods, those movable, identifiable objects that we think of most commonly in the marketplace. And it is the biggest area of law. Now, there's other kinds of law related to real estate law, intellectual property law. Service contracts are a huge area as well. But the biggest of all, I think it's on the task question somewhere, is about sales. And sales relates to the transfer of title of goods. We know that goods over $500 need to be in writing to be enforceable unless it meets one of the exceptions we go over in a later chapter. We also know that it is something that really drives our economy. The sale of goods is the biggest area. Now, a lot of contracts have a mix. What do I mean by a mix? Well, say I take in my motorcycle and I find that there is something broken in it, or the mechanic does. It says, yeah, you need a new head gasket. And I say, well, how much is that? And if the head gasket costs $17, that's a good. A gasket is a good. It's a movable, identifiable thing. But if I say, okay, Ron, I want you to put a new head gasket in for me, guess what's going to happen? There's going to be a contract both for the gasket and maybe some other parts, but there's also going to be a significant portion of it that's going to relate to the service of the mechanic, the labor, the time spent, the expertise that a mechanic brings to the fore as part of the contract. So what do we have there? Well, we have a mixed contract. And so does the UCC rules and application in the common law principles related to sales apply to that contract? And the answer would be, in that one at least, no. How do we determine it then? Whatever is predominant. So if it's more of a service contract, the rules for sales won't apply. If it's more of a sales contract, meaning the goods are more paramount or significant or salient in the contract, then the UCC principles related to sales would apply. When you hear that term sales, it's always what we're talking about goods. What's interesting about that is that sometimes it's a tough call. What is it? Is it really a service contract or a sales contract? And usually they go through factors related to price. How much of the value of the contract relates to the goods versus the services? And that's usually the determining factor. And the book does a nice job trying to distinguish between what is a sales contract versus a service contract. And it's usually what's most predominant. Sometimes contracts have a breakdown as to what the related costs are. And if it's mostly for the services, well, it's a service contract. If it's mostly for the goods, it's a good contract. And sometimes we have a debate because it's a very close call. Now, the thing that's a little bit more technical and important to understand is contracts versus, or contracts to sell versus a sale. A sale is when it's all completed at one time. We think about that when we go to the grocery store. If I bring the goods up to the register and pay for them, that's a sale. It's completed. I've exchanged my obligation. I've tendered my performance, which is money, and I possess and have title to the goods at that moment. It's consummated at the moment of contracting. Sometimes when you buy a bicycle, sometimes even a car, you buy a car sometimes, even though the document of title is not given to you yet, the legal title is actually transferred to you in that moment. And sometimes you're allowed to drive right from the showroom the very day you entered into the agreement. That is a sale. It's all consummated in the same moment, if you will, as meeting of the minds occurs. Anytime you go to the store and buy something, that is a sale. Title transferred to the buyer in the moment of agreement. Now, what are we trying to distinguish then? Well, we're trying to distinguish that in a contract to sell. And I always think of beautiful Gardner, where the Mount's located. At one time, Gardner was the furniture capital of, I don't know if it was just New England or the world. I mean, it really was a large manufacturer of furniture, of all kinds of sort of standard models, but also custom-made furniture. So say I was a real wealthy person and I wanted a very specific sort of like Chippendale design buffet display case type thing, and they didn't have any there, but I met with the sales rep and I said, look, I want it made out of mahogany and I want some kind of beveled glass on the front. And I give them a description and they draw plans and they say, yeah, we can make that for you for $8,000 out of those materials and we'll have it ready for you in 8 weeks. That is not a sale. That is a contract to sell. It's still a contract, but the goods are not yet existing and they can't pass title to me. Why do we distinguish that? Because it's important to understand who has legal title. Because where does risk of loss rest? It rests with the owner. And so we need to know who is actually the owner of goods. Until the goods are in existence and given control to the buyer, it remains in that realm of what we call a contract to sell. There's still a binding legal contract, but I, as the buyer, would not have title to those goods until they exist and they are made available to me either through delivery or they say, hey, it's ready, you can pick it up in the next 48 hours. Then title might pass, and maybe we'll have a bailment arrangement because maybe it's still at their place for a period of time and they might owe a duty of care to take care of it. I'm bringing up way too much complicated stuff. But what am I trying to distinguish between a sale? It's all consummated in one moment. Either the buyer actually physically takes the goods at that moment, or they have the right and ability to. They might leave the goods behind for someone else to come pick them up. Maybe they need a truck. That happened to me. I used to have a Prius, and I used to joke about it in class all the time. Because although it's quite roomy for people inside, Prius was very small for any kind of lugging something. And I bought a large TV for my kids back, I don't know what year that was, a long time ago. And with the boxing and everything else, I actually couldn't fit the TV into my Prius. And so I had to leave it out. I think it was Walmart I bought it from. I had to leave it there. Now, was that a sale or was that a contract to sell? Well, it was a sale. I had the right to possess the goods in title transfer at the moment. Just because I couldn't take it with me at that time didn't change the fact that title did in fact vest in me. Now, we had a bailment situation. While I left that at Walmart, they had a reasonable duty of care to preserve and protect those goods while they were staying in their layaway section over on the side. So contracts versus contracts to sell. And that brings up the next one. Oh, and services, we already distinguished between that. Now, price is interesting. Most people, and I have to agree, in many circumstances, price would be critical to determine whether or not we really have agreement, right? Because think about it. I'm thinking about buying some political button from you. You're thinking about selling. You have an agreement that you want to sell. I have an agreement that I want to buy. And we shake hands on it. We do all kinds of things related to showing intent. What's the problem? We haven't set the price. Would price be critical on one of the rarer, more high-end buttons? Yeah, I think it would be. And if we didn't set the price, I don't think we yet have a contract. We're still negotiating. However, some things in our life would be implied. And I bring it up with plumbers and electrical service people, for example. If they come over and I say, yeah, I want you to put a new length of pipe in. I got a leak in my basement. It's flying all over the place. And they don't set a price, well, chances are that contract would be enforceable because there was enough to show true intent from both parties to be bound, and we'll determine the price based upon what's usually appropriate in the market. This is especially true if we're doing sales of goods on a market. So I'm going to buy an ounce of silver from you, or I'm going to buy an ounce of gold, or I'm going to buy so many bushels of wheat. Those prices can be easily determined by looking at the market at the moment in time that we came to our agreement between the two parties. Okay, they agreed at noontime on a certain date. What was the price of grain going for that volume? And that's what the price of our contract would be. So don't always get so hung up on the fact that, geez, there can't possibly be a contract between buyer and seller because the price wasn't determined. I have to admit, that's a fair argument, though. Price is often a critical element to the meeting of the minds, and if it's not established, there is no contract, but not always. It's kind of a contextual situation. You have to look at it. Was price really necessary to establish, or can we figure it out from the custom in the industry, what parties usually do in that circumstance? Existing goods. What are existing goods? Existing goods are goods that are physically in existence. This iPhone already exists. It's already made. It's here. It's tangible. But it also has to be something that the seller has the power to transfer physically and legally to a buyer. So this cell phone, but you might be, say my son, for example, I'm telling him I'm willing to let him sell this phone for me. It's an existing good in the sense that I possess it and it exists, but the seller, my son, does not yet possess it. Maybe he's a wheeler dealer. He's a middle person. That is not an existing good in his perspective because Jack does not what? Jack doesn't have physical possession and the power to pass title at that moment. So what are the two elements for an existing good? It has to be real and existing. That's the common sense prong. The second prong is the person that's going to sell the good has to have the power to transfer title and physical possession to the buyer. You need both elements. Going back to my furniture example, if I go into the furniture store and I say, yeah, I'd like to order that beautiful Chippendale. Sometimes I've done this before with, I forgot what I bought one time. I bought something and I said, oh, I'm actually buying one right now, like a shed for my yard, and they drop it off on a big flatbed and they're going to drop it off. And I went to this big farm place where they have all the model sheds, and I'm looking at them all, and I said, yeah, we're going to take this one. All right, in my mind, I had this fantasy that, well, obviously I couldn't put it in my truck. It was too big, but I just kind of fantasy they're going to just bring a flatbed and be over like the next day. Like, okay, it's going to be late this September because we have to manufacture it. So what was that? It was not a sale. It was a contract to sell. Although I paid not in full, but I could have. I could have paid in full, and it would be a binding contract on them. It would be a future good. Why? Because it doesn't physically exist. Well, what if it physically existed, but it wasn't at that current lot? They actually have it manufactured somewhere else, and they have to buy it from the actual manufacturer. They're just sellers of sheds. Then it wouldn't be an existing good. It would be called a future good. Although it physically exists, they don't have possession and right to pass title yet. Why do we care? What happens if the shed burned down? What happens if it never got completed? What happens if the manufacturer went bankrupt and the creditor seized their goods through a court action? All those things have to be, well, where does liability rest? It rests with the owner. So in a contract to sale, who's the owner? The seller. Buyer doesn't bear any risk of loss yet because they weren't given the opportunity to exercise dominion and control. The book tends to be a little wordy in this chapter. I think it confuses a lot of students, but it's pretty much common sense, I think. So again, a future good is either a good that doesn't physically yet exist, or the seller doesn't have the right to transfer title and possession to a buyer yet. Either of those two things. Bill of sale is kind of important, and I do urge you for practical purposes, if you're the buyer or the seller of goods, to request or demand that you make out a bill of sale if you're the seller, and if you're the buyer, you want a bill of sale. Is it required? I do think I have a test question on this. Is it required? No, it's not required because legal title is a fictional concept, and as long as the seller had the true intent to pass title to the buyer, we don't necessarily need documentation to make that legally effective. We might if it's an automobile, though, because the bill of sale is often the title document that you need for the registry of deeds. But could you be the legal owner of something even though they didn't draw up the right form? Yeah, you could be. Same with property. You buy real estate, you expect to get a deed. The deed isn't the title. The deed is evidence of title. Same with the title document on a car is evidence of where true ownership rests. But you want a bill of sale for a number of reasons. One is later when we get to chapter, I think it's 19, it's going to be about warranties. What if the goods fail to live up to certain expectations that were promised by the seller? You're going to want a return of money or repairs, and your argument for court will be, well, how much did you pay for it? And if you don't have a bill of sale, then it's going to be his or her word against your word. You can see the challenges there. And another important thing for bill of sales that a lot of people don't think about, I do because I do a lot of criminal defense work, sometimes people come into goods at a very good price, they're happy with it, and all of a sudden, police are knocking on the door and goes, we think you bought some coins recently at some coin shop, and they were actually stolen. And we are going to charge you now with receiving stolen goods. Your defense to that would be a bill of sale to show you were a good faith purchaser and you bought it for value from some third party, and you had no either real actual knowledge or any constructive knowledge, meaning it was so obvious based upon the price or serial numbers on the product was worn out and scratched out, that it would give you notice that it was probably hot goods, so to speak. But bill of sales helps protect you for that. And then later, if you want to sell it too, part of your negotiation might be, hey, I want to sell it for this much. And some buyer says, why is that? Hey, I paid $9,000 for it. Here's my bill of sale. Why would I sell it to you for $5,000? I expect to get something close to it, and I've only had it for a short period of time. Bill of sale is just nice to have. It's a good tool, and it doesn't have to be anything fancy. There's a model in your book. I sometimes bring up stories about my old, I don't want to call him really my mentor, but in a way he was. I used to work for him as a painter. And he was much older than me. He recently died. He was a real character, but he used to like to draw up legal documents. He was very interested in law. He wrote them up in almost broken English because he was a Polish immigrant, and he was really quite a character. And I look back at some of the things he wrote, totally valid, totally appropriate, kind of comical in terms of the language because it sounded, if you read it, like it was written in a broken English. But was it totally understandable what the obligations were flowing back and forth between the party? And it was evidence of their intent. And he used to write up some really nice little sales contracts because he was a wheeler dealer selling stuff besides service contracts of painting. He would sometimes sell certain goods, and he always drew up a bill of sale for the buyer. And whenever he bought anything, he always demanded a bill of sale. In fact, that's one of the last things I represented him on was a lemon law case, which I don't specialize in. So don't call me if you have a lemon law case. I don't do it. We bought a car, and it turned out to be defective, and I had to have a trial over it. So it was one of the funniest things. And it was enjoyable because we won, and I hate to lose my well, I guess he is my mentor in a way, but it's a funny story. But he had a bill of sale, and it really did help part of the valuation of our claim. Illegal sales, why the book has it in the section. Remember, if it's a sale, I bought some goods. I didn't know they were illegal. They're not necessarily an immoral aspect of it, but I bought, I don't know, certain kinds of animals may not be subject to domestication in a certain state. I bought some ferrets from you. If it's a sale and I already gave you the money and I already have the ferrets, we leave the parties where we find them. And that's also true in a contract to sale. So I have a contract to buy the ferrets from you down the road. We both learn or been told by the government that that's illegal. We can't do it. I get to keep my money. You get to keep the ferrets. We leave the parties where they are. The only time we ever undo anything there is what if I already paid for the ferrets, but they haven't delivered them yet? Maybe they're going to come out from the next litter or something like that. They would have to return the money. They're not entitled to a windfall. But as a general principle, if the parties, neither of them executed yet on a contract to sell, the contract becomes void from that previous chapter. I think it was chapter 10. But if the contract has been completed, we don't undo it. We don't rescind it. We don't unravel it and put the parties back where they were part of the contract. We leave them where they are. Now I'm stuck with illegal ferrets, and the other party is happy because they're stuck with the money. Illegal sales, we leave the parties where we find them unless one party is executed, and then the other party must return whatever value they received. And I don't really test anything on international sales contracts, but the good news is there, the United Nations, a lot of people pick on the United Nations because it's sometimes ineffectual to stop wars and things like that, but they have had some great success in this sense that a great many nations are members of the United Nations Compact, and part of that compact is to come up with international sales agreements. And the good news is, I don't want to say they mirror, but they're pretty close to the concepts covered in the Uniform Commercial Code here in the United States. So you're always free to contract with a foreign entity with whatever language you deem appropriate, as long as it's legal in your contracts. But if there's areas where you just did it based upon the expectation of the law to protect you, the laws under the UCC probably are going to be part of the international sales agreements that have been fostered through the United Nations, unless it's one of these more non-signatory nations, but most of them are. They want to be a part of the world stage, and in order to do that, you usually have to play by the rules, so to speak. Otherwise, you don't get commercial or other transactions done with the United States or other participants in the United Nations. And that's it. A little bit of a shorter chapter, I think, in most respects. Chapter 17, a bit dry, but here are some of the exceptions to the rules. Remember, contracts over for goods over $500 must be in writing. Several of the exceptions will be in chapter 17. I don't want to dig into the deep. Let's keep this video somewhat short. Otherwise, have a good weekend. Hopefully, maybe even on Sunday, I'll put up chapter 17 just to get it done. And otherwise, try to stay cool.